All right, this is another T-Rex Arms audio podcast, a T-Rex Talk. This is Isaac Botkin, and I've been, most of this week, watching the American withdrawal from Afghanistan, and I've been trying to figure out what to think about it. But not just what to think about it, I think more importantly, trying to figure out how to think about it. Now, the other thing that I've been doing this week is reading a book by GK Chesterton called Heretics, which was published in 1905. These two different things are going to connect, but you got to give me a little bit of runway so that I can explain how they are related. So the book Heretics was written by GK Chesterton to talk about the ideas of some of his contemporaries, and he starts the book, the very first chapter, talking about Rudyard Kipling. Now, Rudyard Kipling, as you know, is a great poet and storyteller. He was already famous when this book was written in 1905. He'd already written The Jungle Book and Gunga Din, and some of his most famous books and poems were already done. He leans very heavily upon British imperial themes. He's very, very hated today. Modern literary critics do not like Rudyard Kipling because his skin is the wrong color for the stories that he was telling, so cultural appropriation is a major issue that they have. But that is not G.K. Chesterton's main beef with Rudyard Kipling. And he starts out by actually praising Rudyard Kipling because Kipling is an amazing writer and an amazing poet. I would say that all of my favorite poems are probably Rudyard Kipling's. When I read other people who write poetry from this time, even Tolkien, I skip over the poems as soon as I come to one. But when I am reading a Rudyard Kipling book and I come to a poem, I actually stop reading in my head and start reading out loud because he is just a very amazing wordsmith and poet. And so is G.K. Chesterton, by the way. So Chesterton starts out by praising Kipling for the power of his poetry and prose. And then he gets into the issue that he believes that Rudyard Kipling is wrong about. And now, for reference, I want to give you a little bit of historical background, because during Kipling's early writing career, there has been a lot of British imperial action of the British military. The British Empire is at its peak at this point. They've just had the Second British-Afghanistan War, which actually went surprisingly well. There was a pretty successful war that they fought in Egypt and Sudan that was ended in the 1890s, and then there were these expeditionary wars, a bunch of them in the northwestern frontier of India in 1890s, and obviously that was overlapped the time that Kipling was there, so we talked about those a bunch. And then, of course, there was the Great Boer War, which had been happening in South Africa, and that had ended in 1902. So as Kipling is writing, the British Empire is going great guns, and the British Army is doing a lot of stuff and a lot of different theaters, and a lot of Rudyard Kipling's material covers this. So now I'm going to start quoting Chesterton himself as he talks about the message of Rudyard Kipling. Now, the message of Rudyard Kipling, that upon which he has really concentrated, perhaps the best way of stating this fairly would be to begin with that element which has been most insisted upon by himself and by his opponents. I mean his interest in militarism. Now, Mr. Kipling is certainly wrong in his worship of militarism, but his opponents are generally speaking quite as wrong as he. The evil of militarism is not that it shows certain men to be fierce and haughty and excessively warlike. The evil of militarism is that it shows most men to be tame and timid and excessively peaceable. The professional soldier gains more and more power as the general courage of a community declines. Thus, the Praetorian Guard became more and more important in Rome, as Rome became more and more luxurious and feeble. The military man gains the civil power in proportion as the civilian loses the military virtues. So this is a really interesting and important point that Chesterton is making. He's saying that military virtues are a thing that civilians can and should possess. When the civilians lose their military virtues, they lose an ability to push back against the power of the state. They become more luxurious and feeble, like the Greeks and the Romans. They lose their ability to hold the powers that be accountable. And then at the same time, of course, the military professionals, that institutional military structure becomes bigger and more powerful than it should be. And this is what is happening in the British Empire, and this is the sort of thing that Rudyard Kipling writes about and praises. He is a fan of militarism. His worship or his focus is of the military structure, of the institution itself of the military. The military not of specific actions or specific soldiers, but the institution, the part of the state that the military is. And as that standing army, that part of the state that is the standing army grows, it eventually takes more political power. Clausewitz says that war is politics by other means, so whenever your political institutions get very heavily invested in militarism, and they have a very large military institution, then that military power will sort of bleed back into the civil sphere, sometimes very heavily. So again, what Chesterton is saying is the military man gains the civil power in proportion as the civilian loses the military virtues. And that is what happened to Rome in her latter days. So he goes on, as it was in ancient Rome, so it is in contemporary Europe. There never was a time when nations were more militarist, and there never was a time when men were less brave. All ages and all epochs have sung of arms and the man, but we have effected simultaneously the deterioration of the man and the fantastic perfection of the arms. Militarism demonstrated the decadence of Rome, and it demonstrates the decadence of Prussia. So at this time, Britain has the largest empire and probably the largest military power, but Prussia has really led the way with the professional military, the way that they organize their military as an institution, as an arm of the state, the professionalism of their soldiers. This Prussian military model is the one that Britain is following. Chesterton goes on, and unconsciously, Mr. Kipling has proved this, and proved it admirably. For in so as his work is earnestly understood, the military trade does not by any means emerge as the most important or attractive. He has not written so well about soldiers as he has about railwaymen, or bridge builders, or even journalists. The fact is that what attracts Mr. Kipling to militarism is not the idea of courage, but the idea of discipline. There was far more courage to the square mile in the Middle Ages, when no king had a standing army, but every man had a bow or a sword. As we talk about the military here in the United States, we tend to confuse a whole bunch of things that are kind of separate. So as Chesterton is being critical of militarism, the worship of that military structure or the really specific institution of the state military, he is not decrying military virtues. He holds these things separate, two separate things that a people can have. And I think that as we talk about military stuff, it would be wise for us to separate these things in our minds. But generally speaking, when we talk, especially today, especially on the internet, when tweets are so short and internet conversations are so heated, we tend to combine all these things together into one single idea. So militarism, the military structure, the military institution, military actions, which are specific historical conflicts, or military men, the individual warriors, or military virtues, the martial arts themselves, the study of combat skills and capabilities. These are four very separate things. And when we talk about these, it's really easy for people to conflate them, mix them together, and misunderstand what you are trying to say. So right now, as the United States withdraws from Afghanistan, there is a lot to be critical of. There is a lot of decision-making at the very top of the political structure that should be criticized. But there are also people saying you cannot criticize the withdrawal from Afghanistan without criticizing the individual veterans, without besmirching the military actions of the past 20 years, or without saying that we are bad at the military virtues that we as a nation have worked on. And those are all separate things. We can absolutely say those things. And I think that we would do a better job of thinking through some of the lessons to be learned here if we did separate those things and spoke very clearly and precisely about what we want to communicate. But let's go back to Chesterton. He says, "But the fascination of the standing army upon Mr. Kipling is not courage, which scarcely interests him, but discipline, which is, when all is said and done, his primary theme. The modern army is not a miracle of courage. It has not enough opportunities owing to the cowardice of everybody else. But it is really a miracle of organization, and that is truly the Kiplingite ideal. Kipling's subject is not that valor which properly belongs to war, but the interdependence and efficiency which belongs quite as much to engineers, or sailors, or mules, or railway engines. And thus it is that when he writes of engineers, or sailors, or mules, or steam engines, he writes at his best." And the British Army and Navy at that time were a very large institutional industrial kind of thing. So it's I think it's very insightful of Chesterton to see that this is what fascinates Kipling. He's not actually caught up in the really valuable lessons of valor and courage, those martial virtues that are skill at arms, but the organization and the interdependence and just the industrial nature of war. And he's also very caught up just in the larger ideas of British imperialism. Not so much nationalism or patriotism, but British Empire, and not necessarily what is right or what is important. So let's go back to the Boer War. The Boer War is, I think, a perfect example of this. It's a war that is gone into simply because the British Empire needs to expand. It needs to grow. It needs to have power. It needs to have more territory. It needs to have more of Africa. The African map needs to have more English empire on it. And the way that the Boer War was won was not through skill at arms, greater military virtue, but through this large industrial type of new scorched earth warfare. It was won through brutality. The British Army was destroying entire towns and burning farms and slaughtering animals and poisoning wells. And this is also when you see the invention of concentration camps. So there are an estimated 20,000 captured women and children that die, Boer women and children that die inside of British concentration camps during this conflict. And you can see inside of the way that Kipling writes about some of these wars, he's focused on them in a very large, top-down, industrial sort of way. If you read his poem, The Destroyers, which is an amazing poem, it doesn't even have people in it. It just talks about the destroyers themselves, the massive power of the steam engines, the massive power of the guns as they fight. The people don't even come into the equation of the conflict that he describes in that poem. And he's very heavily invested in this imperial responsibility. One of his famous poems is The White Man's Burden, which is, of course, a hugely problematic poem in today's world because it sounds so incredibly racist. The biggest issue with that poem is not the racial aspect, but this imperial aspect. Should have better been titled The Imperialist's Burden. It is the burden that the imperialist must bear, that he has to go everywhere and he has to conquer everybody. What a terrible burden the imperialist must carry. And Chesterton is very critical of this idea. Now, when he criticizes the idea of imperialism in this chapter, he actually doesn't point his criticism at Kipling. He actually points it at Cecil Rhodes, who was one of the instigators of the Boer War. Even though he lived in South Africa, he was very much trying to get this war to happen so that South Africa would be part of the British Empire, so that on the map, more of the African map would have been colored red, the color of the British Empire. So Chesterton says, moderns think of the earth as a globe, as something one can easily get around, the spirit of the schoolmistress. This is shown in the odd mistake perpetually made about Cecil Rhodes. His enemies say that he may have had large ideas, but he was a very bad man. His friends say that he may have been a bad man, but he certainly had large ideas, which is one of the best insults I've read in a long time. That's a lot of damage. But Chesterton goes on to say, the truth is, he was not a man essentially bad. He was a man of much geniality and many good intentions, but a man with singularly small views. There is nothing large about painting the map red. This is an innocent game for children. It is just as easy to think in continents as to think in cobblestones. As these large British institutions, the army and the politicians, are thinking in these very small, childish ways about gigantic movements that destroy entire countries, that bring into play gigantic armies, tremendous damage is done. And I actually think that Kipling changed some of his opinions about this, because very soon after this book was written, very soon after Chesterton was criticizing British imperialism and this focus on militarism inside of these writers' works, Britain embarked on the Third Afghan War, which did not turn out quite as well as the Second Afghan War for them, and also World War I. Now, both of these wars were technically victories, but they were Pyrrhic victories. They were devastating victories. And they really underscore the point that when men lack courage, there isn't a tendency for nations to be, as Chesterton says, fierce and haughty and excessively warlike. What happens is there's a tendency for military institutions and the politicians who command those institutions to have fewer checks and balances. There's much less accountability. They're more likely to embark on imperial adventurism just on a whim. And after those two wars, I actually believe that Rudyard Kipling grew in some wisdom and some maturity and actually changed his opinion on some of these things. He did demand that Britain participate in World War I, and he did so in a very Rudyard Kipling sort of way. It would not be British for Britain not to be part of this grand thing. But he was deeply affected by the loss of his son in that war. And in his later poems, you can see a different attitude come out. So I would recommend that you look at The Gods of the Copybook Headings. I think that is a much better attitude that comes across in that poem. But my recommendation to you is not so much to read more Kipling, although that would be a good thing, or to read more Chesterton, that would be a very good thing. But as we talk about the military in general, military responsibility, national responsibility, that we make sure that we're not putting everything into one single pot, that we actually try to separate these four things, which are always connected in some way, always related in some way, but they're not all the same. Militarism, this focus on the military institution itself and the political powers that wield and control and direct that institution. Military actions, specific actions in history, former battles, stuff that we can learn from, and military men, individual warriors, individual veterans who have done things in the past. And then military virtues, those martial arts, those combat skills, those fighting capabilities, the study of those things. All of these things can be separated from one another and can be criticized and learned from individually. And I think that is very important. And our media likes to pull all of these things together in order to criticize by association things that don't need to be criticized, or to shield from criticism things that really should be criticized. So the bureaucrats at the top of this command chain, or the millicrats, tend to be very adept at doing this. And I saw a video this morning. It was a video that was made by Lieutenant Colonel Stuart Scheller of the United States Marine Corps. The video was a statement that he made on the record asking for some accountability for the poor decisions made by the chain of command that led to dead Marines killed in Afghanistan over the last couple of days. And then I saw a statement from him later today saying that he had been relieved of command for cause based on a lack of trust and confidence. And I predict by the time you listen to this podcast on Monday, there will be a lot of criticism on the internet, people criticizing Lieutenant Commander Scheller because his demand for accountability is going to reflect poorly on the other men in the military. It's going to reflect poorly upon the institution of the military. It's going to reflect poorly upon that great history of the Marine Corps. It's going to reflect poorly upon the fighting capability of Marines, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But it doesn't. His demand for accountability is only a criticism of that military institution and militarism itself. He's questioning the institutional command decisions that political militarists at the top of the structure has made. And so that is why he has been removed from command. That is why he poses a threat. So as we continue to follow this story of what is happening in Afghanistan, the larger story of what happens to empires as they grow and become more militarist, but not necessarily more military capable, there are a lot of lessons that we can learn from the past. And one of the things that I would like all of us to be doing this week is thinking more about how we go about learning those lessons. What categories do we actually need to separate some of these things into? And I think that a helpful start to this conversation is those four categories: the institution of the military, the actions of the military in the past, the individual men related to those actions, and then the skills and capabilities that can be studied. Those are all separate things. There can be militaries that have tremendous battles, but they may not have necessarily the best military virtue. They may not have the greatest capabilities. Or maybe we'll find examples from history where the military had tremendous fighting capability in a number of military actions, but their institutions were corrupt, and the people that were inside are not people that we want to emulate. This is probably not as granular as it could be, but I think that this would be a helpful thing as we talk about some of the lessons that we will need to be learning from the recent withdrawal from Afghanistan. It's going to be an unpleasant topic to discuss on the internet, but hopefully a little bit of clarity and precision in the conversation will go a long way. And this is a conversation that has started a long, long time ago, before GK Chesterton, before Rudyard Kipling. Men have tried to figure this out. and figure out what are the military responsibilities of civilians, what are the political limitations of militaries, how should we structure our institutions. These are very, very important conversations to have, and I think that history and wise men like Chesterton and even Kipling, to a large extent, give us some tools for talking about these things and give us some insights. But you don't have to listen to me. In fact, I'd rather you didn't. I'd rather you go back and you read men like Chesterton and try to learn the lessons from the conversations that they started over 100 years ago. Conversations that take place around these very topics of imperial entanglements and Afghanistan specifically.